Module 22. Well, now that we have completely digested all of our nutrients down into something absorbable, let's talk about it. Let's talk about the absorption in the small intestine. Now, when you perform absorption, you're going to be moving your digestive nutrients from the lumen of your small intestine into the epithelium lining your small intestine, and from there pass the nutrients into your blood or lymph. With regards to what is absorbable, all the monosaccharides are absorbable, so things like glucose, fructose, galactose, but also the pentose sugars that are part of your DNA and RNA. Recall from A&P1, your Chapter 2 on the organic nutrients, that it's ribose as the monosaccharide in RNA and deoxyribose as the sugar, your monosaccharide in your DNA. You do absorb amino acids, okay? Those are the building blocks of your proteins. You can partially absorb dipeptides and tripeptides, but you can't completely absorb them all the way into the blood in that form. So it's partial. And you'll see what I mean when we get to that particular section. You can absorb fatty acids and monoglycerides. You can absorb nitrogenous bases and your phosphates. You also can absorb cholesterol. Now, if you'll think back on what you heard in the last module, there were no enzymes helping you to digest cholesterol, and that's because cholesterol does not need to be digested. It's actually absorbed in its natural state. Okay, no digestion needed. Your electrolytes are all absorbed without the need to digest them, and your vitamins are all absorbed without the need of digestion to occur. So let's talk about absorbing monosaccharides first. Now, you actually are quite gifted at absorbing monosaccharides. Your small intestine can actually absorb 120 grams of monosaccharides per hour. In fact, all of your dietary carbohydrates that are digested are absorbed. So it's a 100%. Everything that gets digested is absorbed. Average healthy diet, all that's really remaining inside the small intestine at the end of absorption is cellulose, which is your plant cell walls, and any fibrous material that could not be broken down. So that's really all that's left. Now, in order to be absorbed, you are going to have your monosaccharides move into your absorptive cells using facilitated diffusion and secondary active transport. Once those monosaccharides are within the absorptive cell, they move to the opposite side, and then they are released into your interstitial fluid through facilitated diffusion, and then they get absorbed across the wall of a blood capillary into your blood through diffusion. You're also pretty good at absorbing amino acids. About 95 to 98% of your dietary proteins that are digested are absorbed. So that's pretty good. Not as good as the carbohydrates, but still 95 to 98% is pretty good. Now, your amino acids are brought into your absorptive cells through facilitated diffusion and secondary active transport, just like the monosaccharides. They're released into the interstitial fluid of the small intestine through facilitated diffusion, and then they're absorbed into your blood through diffusion, same as for the monosaccharides. The difference is the di and the trisaccharides, the di and the tripeptides. Now, di and tripeptides can be brought into the absorptive cells, so into your simple columnar epithelial cells, through active transport. So you can bring those larger peptides in. However, they can't leave the absorptive cells in that form. The dipeptides and the tripeptides cannot move out of those cells and into your interstitial fluid and into your blood. Not going to happen. So once the di and tripeptides are brought into the absorptive cells by active transport, they're going to be broken down by enzymes inside the simple columnar epithelial cells. And when they get broken down into the amino acids that are released can then be absorbed further and moved into the blood. Lipid absorption is a little bit different. Now, with regards to adults, you can absorb about 95% of the dietary lipids that you break down. However, for infants, they only can absorb about 85%. And that lower percentage is actually due to a difference in bile production. Infants produce less bile than adults. And because there's less bile, they don't digest as much of their dietary lipids. And if they don't break down as much, there's less to absorb. Now, with regards to absorption, your short-chain fatty acids can actually diffuse into and out of your absorptive cells by simple diffusion. So they just pass right through those plasma membranes and right into your blood. It's all of the other lipids where you have to do things a little bit differently. So you are going to use your bile salts and you're going to form things called micelles inside your chyme. Micelles are spheres, okay, so they're shaped like baseballs, except smaller. And the surface of the micelle is hydrophilic, so it's very water-loving. The core, the inner core of the micelle is hydrophobic. So what you're going to do is you're going to use your bile salts to form these micelles, and then you are going to use the micelle to collect your larger dietary lipids. So you're going to put your cholesterol, your monoglycerides, your phospholipids, your free fatty acids, your lipid-soluble vitamins, the A, D, E, and K. You're going to take all of these lipids and you're going to tuck them into these little micelles. Now, the reason you need to do this is because all of these lipids hate the water, and your chyme is mostly water. So you need to put them into some kind of a transportation apparatus that can carry them through the chyme. And then, if you look at the lower left-hand image, all those little micelles work their way over during churning to the surface of your absorptive cell. So they go over towards those little microvilli on the simple columnar epithelial cells. Once the micelle reaches the surface of the absorptive cell, the lipids can actually move by simple diffusion out of the micelle and across the plasma membrane into the absorptive cell. Now, once inside the cell, your triglycerides are actually reformed. So you're going to take the fatty acids and the monoglycerides and you're going to combine them together to form the triglycerides again. And then you're going to take the triglycerides along with all of the other dietary lipids and your lipid-soluble vitamins, and you're going to package them together into structures called chylomicrons. Chylomicrons are coated protein structures. So there's this protein coat sort of surrounding the entire structure. And this protein coat keeps the chylomicrons from sticking together, and it keeps them suspended in water. So it makes it kind of water soluble. Now, the chylomicron, this big, huge structure, is not going to be able to leave the cells easily, right? It's not going to be able to pass through a channel. It's not going to be able to bind to a carrier protein for transportation across the plasma membrane. So in order to get the chylomicron out of the absorptive cell and into your interstitial fluid, you're going to have to release it by exocytosis. So we're going to use exocytosis to release our chylomicron into your interstitial fluid. Now, once it's in the interstitial fluid, this chylomicron is way too big to pass across a blood capillary wall. So chylomicron cannot enter the blood. However, remember from your lymphoid system chapter, you also have lacteals. You have those little lymphatic capillaries that are also in the lining of the small intestine. Now, the lacteals can absorb the chylomicron. So you have the ability to move the chylomicron across the wall of the lacteal into your lymph. And then these chylomicrons are going to be carried through your lymph, through all those lymphatic vessels, and then ultimately into the left subclavian vein. So the absorption of your dietary lipids basically requires a back door. It requires something, it requires your lymphoid system owing to their size. All right, so let's talk a little bit about absorbing electrolytes. Now, each ion is handled individually, and the rate at which the ions are absorbed is very tightly controlled, and we are by no means going to discuss each individual ion. Instead, we're just going to kind of hit the major ions, the ones that we have used more frequently in the physiological processes that have been covered in A&P 1 and 2. So for example, sodium. Sodium uptake or sodium absorption rate is equal to dietary content. So if you have a high dietary content, you're going to have a high rate of sodium absorption. If you have a low dietary content, you're going to have a low rate of sodium absorption. Your sodium uptake, your sodium absorption is increased by aldosterone. So you'll have, if you have aldosterone, it will interact with your small intestine and increase your sodium absorption. Now, when sodium is absorbed, it's usually co-transported with your monosaccharides and your amino acids. Chloride is actually absorbed by active transport, and the active transport mechanism actually exchanges chloride for bicarbonate. So as the chloride's being absorbed, your bicarbonate is getting secreted into your chyme. With regards to potassium, potassium is absorbed by simple diffusion. So you've got potassium just kind of flowing down its concentration gradient. So from the high in the chyme through potassium channels into and out of the absorptive cell, into your interstitial fluid, right into your blood. Phosphate is 100% absorbed by active transport. However, when you get to things like iron and calcium, their absorption is based on body need. For example, with regards to calcium absorption, getting calcium into the epithelial cell is going to be through channel-mediated diffusion. So you've got calcium channels in the plasma membrane. You're going to have calcium ions going from the high in the chyme to the low in the absorptive cell. Now, The low in the absorptive cell is actually maintained by two things. You have in the cell a protein called calbindin. Calbindin actually can bind and store calcium, so it basically hides it. You also have in the opposite side of the epithelial cell active transport pumps called calcium ATPase pumps. These pumps are going to grab calcium that is unbound, so they call it free calcium, and they're going to pump that free calcium out of the cell by active transport into your interstitial fluid so you can move it into the blood. Now, you've learned both in A&P 1 and again this semester that you have active vitamin D. And that active vitamin D is called calcitriol. Calcitriol can increase your rate of calcium absorption. And it does that by increasing the amount of calcium channels in the plasma membrane. So it's going to increase the amount of calcium that you can move from your chyme and into the epithelium. It increases the amount of calbindin that you have, meaning that you can bind and store more calcium inside the cell. You also are going to increase the number of calcium ATPase pumps so that as all of this calcium is coming in, you're not just storing it as calbindin, but you're also pumping it out just as quickly into your interstitial fluid. Now, iron absorption is actually stimulated by a hormone produced by your liver called hepcidin. This hormone is going to cause your absorptive cells to start absorbing ferrous ions by active transport. Now you have all of your different vitamins. However, we can kind of generalize vitamin absorption by talking first about your lipid-soluble vitamins and then talking about your water-soluble vitamins. Lipid-soluble vitamins, as I've already mentioned, get packaged along in your micelles. They are absorbed along with all of your dietary lipids by simple diffusion. They then get packaged into those chylomicrons that get released by exocytosis into your interstitial fluid and then move into your lacteals for transportation to your blood supply. Now, water-soluble vitamins, they actually get absorbed completely by simple diffusion. Simple diffusion into your epithelial cells, simple diffusion out of your epithelial cells, and then into your blood. Now, the water-soluble vitamins are your B vitamins and your C vitamin. Now, vitamin B12 is the one that is really different here. Remember, vitamin B12, as I mentioned in our very first module, has to bind to intrinsic factor, which is made by your stomach, in order to be absorbed. Now, the binding of B12 to intrinsic factor creates a really large complex, too large to be moved through a channel or with a transport protein. So this complex is actually going to be absorbed through receptor-mediated endocytosis. So we have to use some modified transport owing to the size of the complex. But the complex does move into the cell through receptor-mediated endocytosis. It goes out of the cell through exocytosis, and it does move into your blood capillaries. Now, water absorption, no water is actively absorbed. Instead, water is just going to flow along its osmotic gradient. Remember, water is going to want to follow sodium. It's going to want to follow the salt. So if you are absorbing sodium from chyme and into blood, water is just going to follow that osmotic gradient ultimately into your blood. You just have to always keep in mind that your epithelial cells have absorbed your nutrients, and they have a really high solute concentration, meaning they have a really low water concentration. And water is going to go from that intestinal lumen, and it's just going to follow in that direction. Now, most of your water absorption occurs in the small intestine, so about 90% of your water is absorbed here. The other 10% is absorbed mainly by your large intestine. You might refer to it as your colon. The stomach absorbs a little bit of water, but again, it's just a really teeny tiny bit. Now, your large intestine is going to receive all of your undigested and unabsorbed chyme. And this undigested and unabsorbed chyme is usually referred to as residue, to kind of give you that impression that this is just everything that's remaining after you have done your digestion and absorption. Now, the large intestine does undergo peristalsis, except it's extremely slow. So your large intestine is kind of sluggish with what it does. However, it does have some unique movements that are worth mentioning. If you look at the image of the large intestine that's on the screen, you can see that it's not the surface does not appear to be a smooth, flat surface. Instead, the large intestine looks like it's gathered into little pouches along its entire length. These little pouches are called haustra. And you have what is referred to as haustral contractions as you are moving residue from pouch to pouch. Now, these haustral contractions are segmentation movements, and they're designed to help mix the contents that are within one haustra and then push those contents into the next haustra, where you will then undergo more segmentation movements. So this movement from haustra to haustra is going to push your developing fecal matter towards your rectum. You also have what are called mass movements. Mass movements are stronger peristaltic contractions that help to move your residue several centimeters at a time. Now, these mass movements are more common beginning at the mid-transverse colon all the way down into your sigmoid colon. And usually they occur within 1 hour after a meal, especially after breakfast. They're going to help you move the feces that have accumulated in your large intestine overnight. However, there are individuals that will get these mass movements after every meal and have these more regular bowel movements. Now, the mass movements are going to be triggered by two reflexes. One is called the gastrocolic reflex. The other is called the duodenocolic reflex. Both of these reflexes are triggered by food filling your stomach and your duodenum. So your stomach is stretching, your duodenum is stretching because you have emptied contents into it, and this stretching is going to increase the motility of your colon. So your colon's going to start to move a little bit faster. If you think about it, if you have food in the stomach, you've got food in the duodenum, you need to empty the colon so that you can make room for all the new food that is going to be put, or all the residue that's going to be leaving your small and entering the large. You also have what is called the defecation reflex. Now, the defecation reflex is actually initiated by stretching of the rectum. So as feces are pushed into the rectum's going to start to stretch, and that's going to stimulate stretch receptors in the wall of your rectum. Now, this is going to stimulate your myenteric plexus, but it's also going to have signals sent up to the sacral region of your spinal cord. Now, the sacral region of the spinal cord is going to send parasympathetic impulses back down to the muscles of the descending and sigmoid colon and the rectum. And it's going to tell these structures to contract. Now, when the rectal muscles contract, it increases the pressure within the rectum, and that's going to cause your internal anal sphincter to open. The internal anal sphincter is composed of smooth muscle, so the opening of this sphincter is completely beyond your control. However, you do have the external anal sphincter as well. This sphincter is under your control because it's composed of skeletal muscle. So when you have that increase in rectal pressure and that internal anal sphincter opens, you have the ability to consciously close the external anal sphincter and prevent defecation from occurring. Now, you've all done it. Okay? I know you all have done it. You have felt the urge. Again, I don't want you to share these stories in lab, but you have felt the urge to defecate. And if it is not an appropriate time for you to get to a bathroom to do what you need to do, you all at some point have clenched that little external anal sphincter, and you have kept it clenched until the contraction in the rectal muscles subsides. And when those muscles relax, the pressure in the rectum decreases, the internal anal sphincter closes, and you can consciously alleviate your control of the external anal sphincter. Now, whenever you have control over a bodily function, issues come around. And this ability of yours to control your external anal sphincter can lead to constipation, which we will be talking about in a couple of slides. Now, with regards to chemically digesting in the large intestine itself does not do anything. The epithelium of the large intestine does not contain any digestive enzymes. There are no glands in the intestinal wall producing any enzymes. However, you do have a lot of bacteria that live in the large intestine. Now, these are the healthy anaerobic bacteria that live in the large intestine. We're not referring to E. coli. Okay, we're talking about what are referred to as your natural flora or your healthy flora. And these bacteria pretty much feast on your residue. So they're going to eat your remains. It keeps them alive. Now, since they're living in your large intestine, think of it as a renter situation where they're renting space in your colon. And if you are renting a house or renting an apartment, you are going to have to pay someone money for the privilege of staying there. So what actually happens is your bacteria are living and feeding thanks to you. The rent that they pay you are vitamins. They actually produce 3 essential vitamins that you need. For example, they produce vitamin K. Vitamin K is needed to produce 4 clotting factors, one of them being thrombin. You learned about the necessity of vitamin K in the ability to clot back in Chapter 18. You also produce vitamin B5. Vitamin B5 is necessary for the body to produce steroid hormones and to produce certain neurotransmitters within the central nervous system. It also produces biotin, which is another B vitamin. Biotin is necessary for normal glucose metabolism inside the body. So yes, these bacteria are guesting in your colon and they're feeding off of your remains, your residue, but they do pay you back with a lot of really essential vitamins. Now, um, since they are acting on your residue, they are breaking down your remaining organic waste. They do ferment any carbohydrates that are remaining. So if you've had that really high starch content meal, like lots of beans, okay, good rich bean meal, you might not have broken down all of your starches into monosaccharides. So you might have some of that starch remaining when your residue goes into the large intestine. Now, this fermentation process does cause your bacteria to produce an interesting byproduct called flatus. Flatus causes flatulence because flatus is your intestinal gas. And flatulence is when you, for layman's terms, you need to fart. So if you have that really high carbohydrate meal and the next day you're a little gassier than normal, you now know that it's just due to the normal bacteria in your colon fermenting your leftover carbohydrates, and you've got some gas forming. Now, the fermentation of the carbohydrates makes the gas, but the odor does not come from this fermentation. The odor is going to come from something else. Now, these bacteria also act on your bilirubin. They're going to break the bilirubin down into urobilinogen and stercobilinogen, which is then going to continue to be broken down into urobilin, which is yellow, and stercobilin, which is brown. So your bacteria are going to continue the breakdown of that bilirubin waste product from red blood cell destruction and contribute to the overall color of your feces. Your bacteria are also going to convert remaining proteins into amino acids, and then they continue to act on the amino acids and break them into simpler substances such as indole and skatole, also ammonia and hydrogen sulfide. Now, these four products are going to contribute the characteristic rotten egg odor to your feces. So that's where the smell comes from. Now, with regards to how long it takes, on average, chyme can remain in your large intestine for up to 36 to 48 hours as it's very slowly being moved along all those haustra. It could, however, take less time to move chyme through your large intestine. It all depends on the level of motility you have, so the quickness of the muscular contractions. The goal of the large intestine is to prepare your fecal matter for ejection. So what you're going to do is you're going to start to absorb water. So this is where you absorb that remaining 10% of your water. You reabsorb some electrolytes, you reabsorb the bile salts in here, you reabsorb vitamins because you have those bacteria producing vitamins in the large intestine, so you're going to need to absorb them. However, the longer your chyme remains in the large intestine, the longer you have to start reabsorbing things like your organic waste and toxins. So for individuals that have that longer period of time in the large intestine, you actually can move more waste products back into your blood. Now, what you form is, for the most part, a semi-solid. Your feces, believe it or not, are still 75% water and 25% solid on average. Now, within your feces, um, the solid portion, about 30% of the solid material are actual bacteria. Another 30% are undigested dietary fiber. About 10 to 20% any remaining fat that was not broken down and absorbed. You also will have any proteins that are remaining. You'll actually have some epithelial cells in here that have sloughed off the lining of your large intestine. You'll have some salts, mucus, and any other remaining secretions that were not reabsorbed into the body. Now, there are two disorders that go with the large intestine that I do like to talk about because they're very common, especially in American culture. You have diarrhea and you have constipation. Now, we're going to talk about constipation first. Constipation is defined as infrequent or difficult defecation due to a decrease in large intestine motility. So what that means is your large intestines are contracting more slowly than normal, and that means you're not having defecation as frequently as you need it. And when you do defecate, it tends to be more difficult than normal. Now, the reason your defecation becomes so infrequent and so difficult is that you start having excessive water reabsorption. So think of it this way. You've got your residue coming in, and the goal of your large intestine is to compact your residue and form feces. And part of that compaction process is water absorption. So your large intestine is sucking water out of your residue, making it drier. The only thing is when you have constipation, your residue is not moving very quickly. And the longer the residue stays in the large intestine, the more water you end up absorbing. So you start absorbing well more than you're supposed to. And your feces start to become very hard and very dry. And hard, dry feces are going to be a lot more difficult to pass, which is why defecation becomes less frequent. And when you try to defecate, it's a lot harder to do. Now, constipation, there's many different causes for it. One is denying your reflex. So you remember when I was talking about the defecation reflex and I mentioned you have control over the external anal sphincter and you can contract it and you can hold your feces in there and not defecate. Well, the thing is that you deny that reflex, you leave your residue in the large intestine longer, meaning the large intestine is going to continue to suck water out of your feces, making them drier the longer you hold them in. So chronically denying your reflex makes your feces harder, more difficult to move, much drier. So you actually could consciously be inducing constipation and not realize that you're doing it. Colon spasms, so irregular muscular contractions in the large intestine that prevent normal peristalsis movement, that could end up holding things in there a little bit longer than normal. Having a low fiber diet, low water intake, no exercise, these all contribute to less motility in the large intestine. Also, emotional stress could cause constipation, and certain medications, especially pain medications like morphine, cause constipation. So some of these causes are under your control and some of them are not. There are different ways to deal with constipation. Um, what you should always do first is a more natural approach. So increase the amount of fiber in your diet. Fiber tends to be very scratchy, and as fiber is moving its way through the large intestine, it irritates the lining of your large intestine, and that irritation actually stimulates muscular contractions and keeps the muscle, the peristalsis, moving. Increase your water intake. It's going to make your residue wetter when it enters the large intestine so that your feces don't quite get as dry as quickly. Exercise is a huge motility stimulant. So just being more active will encourage you to have um, better uh, movement through the large intestine. You also do not want to deny your reflex. So you want to make sure that if you need to go, you go. And it's actually the one thing that people are less likely to do. If you've ever noticed, most people are quite comfortable saying that they have to pee, but very few people will say, even to their family members, I need to poop. I don't know, there's just a negative connotation with this particular bodily function, and it's the one thing that we're more apt to deny during the day, especially if you're in a commonly used bathroom and someone goes into the stall next to you. You don't want to have them hear you defecate, so you hold it in. It's a whole vicious cycle. You just need to go. Everyone defecates. It's all good. Now, if the higher fiber, if the water intake, if the increase in exercise, if going when you need to go, if those things don't relieve the constipation, there are things called laxatives that can actually help to alleviate the constipation. For example, there are laxatives that are referred to as stimulants. Now, stimulant laxatives are like X-Lax, are going to artificially stimulate your muscle to contract. So it's going to irritate the muscles of the large intestine and actually make the muscle contract faster. I would caution you about using those because your large intestine's kind of lazy and it starts to become habit forming, where the large intestine is going to rely on the chemical stimulant to contract. So coming off of the X-Lax, coming off of the stimulant, can actually cause constipation because your large intestine will actually forget how to contract on its own. There are laxatives that are called lubricants, and lubricants are going to actually add an oily component to your residue. For an example, mineral oil is a lubricant. Mineral oil is not absorbed by the human body, so if you take mineral oil, it stays in the chyme, it stays in the residue, makes your residue kind of really slippery, and even if you're absorbing more water than you're supposed to, the residue is just really greasy and it's going to pass more easily. The only problem is that you could end up with what's called anal leakage. But again, it's a toss-up. Chronic constipation, a little anal leakage, personal preference. There are osmotic laxatives. Osmotic laxatives actually prevent the water absorption. So the residue comes in, and because of the osmotic difference to the residue, water will actually stay with the salt in the chyme and not get absorbed. The problem with osmotic laxatives is that instead of forming feces, you tend to have more diarrhea as a result. So it alleviates the constipation, but it swings you completely the other way. You could take a bulk fiber laxative, something like Metamucil or Citracel, where you've got um, the where you're ingesting extra fiber to help stimulate the movement of your large intestine. Any of these will work to help alleviate the constipation. But again, there's always a pro and a con. There's always a side effect that you have to weigh in. Now, diarrhea is the opposite of constipation. Diarrhea is described as an increase in the frequency, the volume, and the fluid content of your feces. And it's due to an increase in motility. So the muscles of the large intestine are working faster than normal. And because your muscles are contracting faster than normal, you don't have as much time to absorb water. So you end up with less water absorption, and instead of absorbing 10% more water, that 10% is actually leaving with your feces, which is why they're so watery. Now, there are various causes for it. Stress can cause diarrhea. So there are people that have stress-induced constipation. Other people could have stress-induced diarrhea. Now, lactose intolerance also causes diarrhea. In lactose intolerance, you actually are missing lactase. You're missing that enzyme. So the lactose sugar comes in with your dairy products, passes all the way through the small intestine and into the large intestine, and that undigested disaccharide causes bloating, cramping, and diarrhea. Different drugs can cause diarrhea. In fact, many antibiotics, if you read the labels, diarrhea is sometimes a normal side effect of those medications. And various microbial infections can cause diarrhea. Now, diarrhea is something you need to watch because it can very quickly lead to dehydration and electrolyte imbalances. Remember, your large intestine is supposed to absorb 10% more water and some electrolytes. If you have diarrhea, things are passing through your colon so quickly, you're losing that water that you need, and you're not regaining those electrolytes that you need. So when you have diarrhea, it's actually recommended that you drink more water than you normally would to kind of counteract the effect of the dehydration. It's also recommended that you do things like Pedialyte, where you're not just supplementing the water, but you're also supplementing in the electrolytes that you need as well. Now, to cure diarrhea, if it's stress-induced, all you'd have to do is remove the source of the stress. If it's lactose intolerance, they have this wonderful little pill that you can buy at any Walgreens or Target or Walmart. It's called Lactaid. It's a small pill that actually contains the lactase enzyme. So you pop that pill prior to eating whatever dairy product you want, and the enzymes in that pill will break down the lactose sugar for you. If it's caused by a drug, removing that drug from your system, so finishing your antibiotic prescription, usually going to be enough to help alleviate the diarrhea. If an infection has caused your diarrhea, you most likely will have to go on an antibiotic to clear the microbial infection, and that antibiotic could continue your diarrhea while you are resolving the infection. However, once the infection is cleared, once your course of medication is over, your large intestine should get back to normal function quite quickly.